This is the Boundless Pursuit Podcast, a show highlighting the purity of the experience without limitation. Each week, we'll bring anglers as diverse as the fish they chase, whether it be from your backyard or your bucket list. Freshwater, saltwater, conventional gear, or fly. We're bringing stories and perspectives from fishermen from all walks of life, from across the country and globe. In the digital age, authentic communication and networking is critical, and I'd love to hear from you about show suggestions, potential guests, or general feedback. And you can reach me at boundlesspursuitfishing@gmail.com or at my website, www.boundless-pursuit.com. That's where you'll find the entire collection of written articles, podcast episodes, and media. I deeply value the feedback, ratings, reviews, and support of my listeners, and I look forward to hearing from you. I'm your host, David Graham. Now let's get on to today's episode. Okay, I'm pretty fresh back from Spain and my Wels Catfish trip, and unfortunately, I'm going to be recording this a little under the weather. I'm not feeling my best, but I don't want to wait to record this because I don't want to forget any little details. But before I dive right into the trip itself, I just want to give some context or some back history and just talk about my discovery of the Wels Catfish in general, like how it got on my radar in the first place. I vividly remember the first time that I saw a photo of a Wels catfish. I still have the photo. This enormous catfish, this huge fish being held in knee-deep water by two anglers that were struggling to keep it up. The thing was like 8 feet long, just massive. And I saw the photo, I don't know, around 2003 maybe. So we're talking over 20 years ago. And you really weren't seeing things like this at the time. It was mind-blowing. That photo had been circulating the early internet like a firestorm. And it was sweeping through emails as like a chain email. I think that's what they used to call it, or basically like your early form of spam. And for me, it was on my old AOL account, for anybody who remembers the old AOL days. But I mean, in 2003, I'm a teenager, I'm high school age. Social media doesn't even exist at this point, but I'm in the early stages of my time as an angler. And this is around the time frame things are really starting to snowball for me. But that email, I think in the email, it claimed that the giant fish was caught below like a local dam or something. But I've always been enough of a skeptic to question things. And I knew enough about fish and fishing, even in those early days, to know that this thing was not caught in America. Even then, like a quick browse online showed me that this was a European species of fish called a wels. Still, that photo planted a seed, and that particular photo was popping up all over the place. I spent my early days as an angler in high school fishing around the Santee Cooper system of South Carolina. And the Santee is renowned in its own right for its catfish. It's just an awesome system. And catfishing is a massive culture around Lake Moultrie, Lake Marion, and the Santee River system as a whole. All the local waterfront bait and tackle stations generally host tournaments and have weigh stations and bragging boards where people like to nail their catches up and pose for a picture. You know, those old school pictures where people actually take the catfish and nail its head to a board. And for these bait shops, it's like a badge of honor to have weighed the biggest fish, to have been the station or the camp of choice. And maybe that urge to be the guy or to be the shop, I don't know. Maybe the urge is enough so to be dishonest, because I recall vividly one of my favorite bait shops near the diversion canal that, you know, basically that's the canal that connects Lake Moultrie to Lake Marion. But I remember that bait shop having the same photo of that Wels catfish posted on the wall behind the counter. The same one that had been in my email. The same one that's floating around all over the place. And a lady behind the desk, this lady with this just awful smoker's voice, she proudly claimed that the fish was caught near their camp. She even went so far as to say she knew the guy that caught it. Now, I never felt compelled to correct her. I just kind of laughed under my breath at the lunacy of these folks. I just needed to get my bait and get out of there. But this like need to be part of the story is just funny to me. That even in those early days, I knew that I was on course to start chasing like the world's crazy giant freshwater fish like that. I knew about the Wels catfish at this point, and I knew that one day when I have the resources available, I'm going to go do that. And so fast forward 20 years, and here we are, a proper progression, worked towards, and graduated to. I'm finally in position now to start chasing some of these dream fish. Now, I can't go do this stuff 10 times a year. Maybe eventually I will be able to, but for now, I can at least start doing like at least one per year. So when I go, I have to make it count. I have to be calculated, smart, and I have to use my resources and connections. So when I was presented an opportunity to join my recent connections, Thumb and Yuri Grizendi, who I recently fished with in Suriname, I knew I had to take that shot. And Yuri is obviously like the Wels catfish guy. And here's kind of where the great irony of all this comes in. That photo, the one that I'd seen 20 years prior, Yuri Grizendi was there that day. And I've even recently connected with the angler who caught the fish, a guy named Lucas Vandergeest. It just kind of speaks to how small the world is, or at least how small the world of big game freshwater fishing is. But Yuri, with all the connections and insights into the Wels catfish game, he had this idea to do Spain and fish the Ebro River, which is synonymous with big whales. But he wanted to do it from belly boats using lures and live scope, not to toss out some sort of pellets or bait and weight. And he had this connection with a guy named Peter Hutting, a Dutch guy who specializes in this style or this approach. And this has been like the newest, biggest thing in fishing for whales lately, hunting them out of belly boats. And it's my understanding that Wels catfish are very intelligent. You know, we like to think of our catfish in the States as being kind of lumbering and stupid and eating anything in their path, which even for our catfish isn't necessarily true. Maybe more true for some than others. But Wels catfish are very smart fish, and they pick up on things and they learn things very quickly. And hot new bites don't last long because they adapt fast. So this belly boat thing is it right now. This is the way, and it's best to strike while the iron is hot. And right now, Peter is the guy. Peter is revolutionizing this style of fishing and perfecting it. And so this was a great opportunity to fish with a true specialist. So we booked a trip to Spain, and Thumb, Yuri, and I would be teaming up again on a quick turnaround. This is what I love, though. You get guys from America, Thailand, Italy, and the Netherlands all teaming up together in Spain in the pursuit of one monster fish. And I think I've said it at this point time and time again, that fishing is just a great connector, awesome experience, and awesome opportunity, as this was my first time traveling to any European country. I figured if nothing else, at least we would have a lot more comforts than we did in the jungles of Suriname. And what was nice is this time I didn't have to lug around a bunch of giant rod tubes and weatherproof trunks. No checked luggage or worrying about weight capacities this time. With Peter's program, he supplies all the gear, the rods, reels, all tackle, the boats, electronics, obviously. All I had to do this time was bring clothes and maybe some camera gear. So I flew into Barcelona, no anxiety over checked baggage at least. Everything very seamless at the airport and through customs. And there I met up with Thumb, his cameraman, and Yuri, and we were picked up by Barry Postma from Holland. And from Barcelona, it's a fair drive west out to the area of Casp. Now, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm putting some kind of American slang on it. But Casp, C-A-S-P-E. And it's an interesting drive where the more like modern layout of Barcelona kind of transitions into older farmlands scattered between mountains and hills. The landscape is pretty barren, like it's very much like a desert. It looked a lot like Idaho to me, at least the area of Idaho that I visited for my sturgeon trip, that southwestern area. Very hilly, mountainous, and just rugged look to it. But you'd see these old remnants of like Gothic era buildings everywhere. I mean, everywhere. These old crumbling stone buildings and structures. And it's really interesting because with a lot of them, you'd see that like over time, people had built onto the sides of those old ruins. So these more modern structures were built literally onto the bones of old stone homes. So it's just pretty cool stuff. But we got to our lodging, though, at Ebro Total Fishing, which Barry has recently assumed control over. A quaint little spot near the Ebro River. Very welcoming layout. They'd even put all of our nation's flags out front and had the quote, "feels like home," written on the front of the building, which was, a nice little touch. Very welcoming. So we all got inside and we all got settled into like little dorm rooms, very comfortable little rooms. A cool setup for sure. And there, just on day one, we enjoyed a quick meal before Peter Hudding came in with a prepared video tutorial on the fishing that we'd be doing. So Peter himself has developed a very particular system for these whales with belly boats. And I've known a lot of very dialed in anglers and guys who have perfected their craft, but Peter has really put something unique together here. And this video showed in great detail, step-by-step instructions on how to utilize the belly boat, the live scope, the lures, down to like extremely precise detail, the approach to trigger, and a near guaranteed bite. He showed like live PO video, one after another, showing the method working over and over. And I think it was one of the most fascinating things that I've ever seen, like these videos of live bites. Now, I swore to secrecy what Peter taught us and showed us in person and in those videos. He's a guy that I respect tremendously and someone that I now consider a friend. And so I will not detail the super technical side of how we caught these whales or how we triggered the bite. I'll just simply state the fact that it was out of a belly boat using jigs and live scope. The classroom setting video tutorial was real exciting though. I felt like a student. And of all the things in fishing, I love nothing more than feeling like a student and being able to learn and then demonstrate what I've learned. I like showing and proving what I can do. And Peter was just dead serious about his program, and you could feel it. But all the while, we were pretty concerned because the weather forecast were showing terrible winds forecasted for the next 2 days of fishing, like 25 to 30 mile an hour sustained winds, not gusts, like full on blasting the entire time, start to finish for the entire day, sunrise to sunset. So to be trying to learn precision movement and fishing in an inflatable craft under those conditions was going to be a challenge, to say the least. Now, I roomed with Yuri during the trip, and you could feel the winds the first night pounding on the property, rattling the doors, jarring the windows. I mean, this windstorm was inevitable. Still, Peter is no fair weather angler. The guy is a diehard. He's the real deal. And he said for him alone as an individual, these are the days that he trains. Like an athlete, no days off. He trains. So day one would be training, if nothing else, on what to do in the worst conditions, which it's all a matter of perspective. Deal with the worst of it early on, and it only gets easier over time. That's not worst case scenario. If anything, that's the best case. So the next day, we got out on the river early the first day, and we just see howling winds, white caps, water misting. I mean, it was ugly out there. He took one look and knew we're going to get wet. So I got suited up as much as I could. I stuffed all that I had into dry bags and just pretty much embraced the fact that today was going to be cold, wet, and sloppy. Now, Peter has a great program and a specific and organized manner by which he loads and unloads the gear from his trailer. We unloaded each belly boat with numerically organized and corresponding gear boxes, and we got set up into the water. And I set off into the water, and you're really moving in reverse for the most part in the belly boat with the trolling motor. So everywhere you're going, you're kind of going backwards. And immediately I start getting swept away, smacked around by the waves, totally out of control, and being pushed into like trees and limbs. I was just getting my ass handed to me. I think I probably floundered around for about 5 to 10 minutes before I finally kind of got a feel for the wind direction and the thrust needed to cut across the river, where this big, tall, rocky bluff was creating like some small amount of relief from the wind. And along that rock wall, we mostly worked on just navigation of the boat and the sonar unit, like how to recognize fish on screen and how to approach them. And the area was definitely full of life. Like you'd see on the live scope, big groups of carp swimming around. Like you could make out the body shape and see the movement of the tail of individual fish. It was very cool. And I've heard so much about forward facing sonar and live scope. I've never had much opinion on it, and I've got no experience on it at all. Certainly, as a tool to locate fish and to find specific fish, it's revolutionary. Still, it didn't change the fact at all that I felt like a total novice who didn't know what they were doing. Occasionally, though, as I got better at kind of the search pattern and how to find fish, we find a big Wels catfish. Now, the screen of the Garmin has like these grid lines, and the axis of the chart would show each segment of the grid was like roughly 1 meter by 1 meter. And I found Wels come across the screen, essentially swimming underneath my paddling feet that were more than 2 squares long. You're talking about fish that are nearly 8 feet in length. And seeing these things come across the screen is terrifying. So, on top of legitimately not being efficient at piloting the boat that I was in, you compound the inexperience with the brain cluttering, knee shaking feeling that you get when you see a giant fish. And I mean, you just lose all senses. To line up the perfect shot on these fish requires like 10 different things to go perfectly right. Not a single one thing could be off or you blow it. But day one was just great training. Good to get control over the boat under the worst conditions early and get it out of the way. Unfortunately, we had similar conditions forecasted for the second day. And once again, we dealt with excessively high winds that restricted where we could fish. We had to be very strategic even with where we put in. Obviously, looking for kind of wind-sheltered shorelines and bank lines. So basically, we're limited to a few wind-sheltered rock walls. But with our bearings about us much better, though, we were at least able to focus on the fishing. And Yuri, Thumb, and I were able to fish independently and do our own thing, while Peter monitored and helped some of the more well-hidden fish. And for me, like I flat out could not spot the fish that were down in the rocks. On screen, it was just a mess of blobs and colors, and I couldn't tell what was a rock and what was a fish. Just not that advanced yet. Like I could find the suspended fish that were cruising in the middle of the water column, but once they got down on the bottom, embedded in grass, close to the shore, or buried in rocks, I had no idea how to get them out or notice that they were there. But still, I finally managed to start catching fish. I started with a smaller fish, using the tactics and the timing that was showed to us by Peter, and seeing how well it worked with the smaller fish, I tried to apply it to larger specimens. But the larger, more cunning, and just seasoned Wels just proved to be more difficult to fool. But as the day progressed, we finally started kind of getting the bites and getting the strikes that we wanted. And on a number of occasions, I managed to get all the stars aligned to get a strike out of large fish, but I was missing them. Failed hookups. Their mouths are just so tough and difficult to hook. I don't know what I was doing wrong, but I'll tell you, when a giant Wels smacks a lure vertically, you feel this shock wave that reverberates through your entire body. There's a tremendous power that's undeniable. But even with the misses, before the end of the day, I was able to experience the power and the fight of a proper-sized Wels catfish, a nice specimen of around 2 meters or maybe like 6.5 feet long. I was real interested on what the fight would be like with a fish like this, and they're shaped kind of like a giant tadpole. But I'll say the fight of a big Wels is tough. I think when you fight almost anything straight up vertically, it's never very easy. But with the Wels, it's just this long, sustained downward runs. They fight mostly vertically, and they're trying to pull very intentionally to the bottom. The terrible part here is just the ergonomics of the belly boat itself. You have no opportunity to support yourself with your legs against the sounding fish. So when they pull down, you absorb 100% of that power into your lower back and your arms. You can't plant your feet because it's water. And it's just so awkward because after a lifetime of feet on solid ground when catching a fish, your feet like instinctively just sort of flail around and start trying to find support when you're fighting them. It's brutally taxing on your back and arms. If not for this little crossbar that Peter uses in the front of the belly boat, it would be really hard because at least with that bar, you could like hold the rod in one hand and support yourself with the other hand by holding on to that bar. But I've heard mixed reviews out of the fight of a Wels. I personally was impressed. Just power, just sustained downward pulling, and pretty good stamina as well. Now, when the fish breaks surface and you have to go hands on, that's when things get really awkward as well because you're essentially trying to pull their face into your lap. So you're like managing the rod with one hand and trying to lift this enormous mouth. Like the lips on the bigger fish is like trying to grab the side of someone's arm. You just can't get your fingers and thumbs in there. You just can't get your fingers and thumbs in there. All the while, this thing's swinging its head around with treble hooks sticking out. And obviously, you don't want a situation where you're buttoned to a 200-pound fish by a hook. It's a delicate matter, very tough. But luckily, Peter was always nearby, especially if somebody hooked up. Peter would come over and just provide the proper coaching. And he ended up assisting with getting the fish grabbed and contained. And the wind actually blew us across the river in all the chaos and essentially pushed us onto a flat where we just stopped to take photos anyway. So getting the fish to shore wasn't hard. It was done so naturally by gusting winds. But man, finally getting one of these things in my hands was a great feeling. I've got a long list of dream fish, like targets, monster freshwater fish around the world. But there's a handful that are just a little more meaningful or interesting to me, and the Wels has been one. Longer than most. Maybe second only to the Arapaima, which I had known of and dreamed of since I was in the 4th grade. But we got a few good photos. My waders got filled up with waters by waves crashing over me, but it didn't matter. We're one real fish in now. But we finished that day without much more action. I think Thumb ended up getting a pretty nice one as well. A few more smaller fish caught, some so small that we just shook them loose at the side of the boat. But we're all excited that the following days were virtually windless, much better conditions. It should be much, much easier to approach the Wels that we found like with stealth. But every night that we're returning to like the lodge was so much fun because we're getting to enjoy one another's company. We're having dinner together and just telling fish stories. But I'll admit, I'm one of those guys that always hits the sack early. I felt a little antisocial, a little guilt there because I'd hear the other guys out there talking and cutting up. But man, when I'm tired, I have to get in bed. I'm one of those early get in bed kind of people. When I'm tired, I just check out. But we hit up another area on the 3rd day, much calmer conditions, almost near glass-like conditions on the surface of the lake. Fully charged, we spent the full day just proactively searching and canvassing the area looking for fish. Now, at this point, we're all pretty efficient in the boats. We all know how to comb the area and search and operate the boat correctly and everything. Mysteriously, though, once the wind went, it seemed that all the quality-sized Wels went with it. We could not find a proper-sized fish to save our lives at all. Hours and hours, long distances covered, even being towed around by a tether connected to a shuttle boat to search new areas. We couldn't find the big fish. They're just completely gone. What I did see a lot of were big pods of spawning carp, like tons of carp crashing in the weeds along the shoreline. And if you've ever personally witnessed the way that common carp spawn, they just create all kinds of chaos, all kinds of noise. Like when common carp spawn, the whole world knows about it. They pile on top of each other, they thrash, and they force themselves into dense shoreline vegetation, and they just cause all kinds of commotion. And big Wels, being very keen on vibrations and disturbances, I would think, would be attracted to that. So at one point, I actually moseyed the belly boat as close as I could to a group of spawning carp. And on the live scope, I found several quality-sized Wels that seemed to be sitting right on the outskirts of the action. Like I would look up and see all these carp going crazy about 25 feet from me along the shoreline. Then I looked down at my screen where the shoreline tapered off into a deeper drop off, and there was some decent Wels catfish. I'm assuming attracted by the sound of the spawning carp. I mean, it would, after all, be a very easy and convenient meal. The carp get so preoccupied with spawning, you could just about walk up to them and poke them in the head. It shouldn't be that hard for a Wels catfish to sneak up and eat them. But that third day, we didn't get any big fish. And so the next day of fishing, we searched another region. Similar results, though. Similar observations. We would find juvenile whales out and about, but we just couldn't find the big fish. Or if we did, it was weird. They'd be like rapidly cruising, almost so fast that you couldn't keep up under the power of the electric motor. Like they were flying across the top of the water. You could be in 60 feet of water, and if we found big fish, for whatever reason, it seemed like they were within 6 feet of the surface, cruising fast. And you chase and chase until they ultimately just moved into areas that were too shallow to follow, and you just couldn't track their movements any longer. My best guess, and this is just a hypothesis, but my guess is that the carp spawn had some effect on the larger fish. Maybe they were just staged up shallower where we couldn't detect them on the live scope. Or maybe I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm not the Wels guy. It just, to me, it makes some sense to me. And I'm sure that there's at least a little truth to it. But we ended up returning to our original location, like the spot where the wind had been so bad that first day. And really the only area that we saw decent numbers of large fish. Again, though, even there, the larger fish were sparse now. Conveniently, when the wind had died down, now the fish don't want to be found. But we were at least seeing some, and we were even getting shots. I had at least one very large fish that struck at my lure and just didn't hook up. Like you'd search for hours and hours and hours to finally find a fish, and to find a fish that you could actually line up a shot on and to actually trigger the bite, only to miss it. It's just heartbreaking. I did manage a few smaller fish. For the most part, I was passing all the small fish that I saw, but to break up the monotony, I'd stop and catch a few of the smaller fish. I could have probably captured numerous smaller whales had I cared enough. But again, I'm just trophy hunting at this point. But before the end of the day, I finally got the opportunity that I wanted. I got the opportunity to encounter a big Wels. Peter had found the fish, hollered over to the nearest angler, who luckily was me. He'd tracked it, he'd followed it, and everything. And that was a good thing about having that seasoned set of eyes. He was out there patrolling and probably able to find some of the big fish that we would have likely missed. I managed to go tight on the fish and keep tight on a monster Wels that stayed buttoned. And this fish was tremendously heavy and powerful. And the crazy thing is, while you're fighting them, you can look to your side and watch the fish that you're fighting on the live scope fighting below you. And you can get an idea of how big it is before it even comes to the surface. And this thing was enormous, at least by my standards. But again, it's just such an awkward and difficult way to fight a fish from the belly boat. Just no proper leverage at all. So this thing, took me on a sleigh ride, obviously, pulling me all over the place. But when this thing came to the surface, it was just an absolute beast. But I was terrified and horrified because it was barely hooked. The treble from the jig was just hardly piercing, like a thin membrane of flesh on the fish's snout. So one hard pull could ruin it all. The fish flopped and dove down several times, each time giving me all kinds of anxiety that surely it was going to pull a hook, before finally I managed to get the fish up and direct it towards Peter, who could grab its jaw for me. But we got the fish contained. We got it boated. We didn't want to take any risks. We ended up getting the fish pulled into the boat that Barry was in, and we hauled it over to shore where it measured just over, I think, 2.3. I think it was like 2.36 meters. I don't know, just under 8 feet long. I think that's roughly like 7'7", 7'8". I don't know what my conversions are off the top of my head. But I mean, to me, this thing is colossal. And they get quite a bit bigger. I mean, I think fish up to 9 feet have been caught, maybe even more. But when you're so used to American-sized catfish, I mean, the size and dimensions of these things is just insane. The head I mean, the size of the head is really hard to comprehend. Most of the fish is in like the front quarter of the body length. It's just this massive head and shoulders, and then the rest of the body length is just tail. Like I said earlier, it's like a massive tadpole. But the head, the mouth, the jaws is really just something crazy. And the interior of the mouth, especially like the roof of their mouth, is just solid as a rock and just lined with these abrasive pads. And so interacting with the fish, feeling the jaw structure, it was a lot easier to understand why many of the fish that bit weren't staying hooked. There's just not a lot of soft tissue in there. But we got the fish photographed, measured, and sent on its way. And I mean, that was a wrap. That was what I came there to see and experience. One of my all-time longest standing bucket list fish. And just in terms of travel fishing, international monster hunting, Guyana, my first trip, was spectacular. I maintain, even now, probably best freshwater fishing on planet Earth. I've maintained that. And Suriname was a grind, but special. But this pursuit of whales, like especially with this style, is one that I'm really eager to do again. I'd like to do all the trips that I've done before again. It would be very easy for me to revisit some of the places that I've already gone and things that I've already done. And I really want to, but I know that I need to stay on course and continue to chase new things. But man, I honestly think that this particular experience and this style of fishing is probably one that I'd like to do again most. And all of us, like Yuri, Peter, Thumb, we've all talked about potentially meeting up in Italy or some other European country outside of Spain. I'm definitely down to do it, but I know I need to stay disciplined. I need to prioritize the places that I want to go and the other things that I want to catch, because unfortunately, as things stand right now, I can't do it all. The time off just isn't there. The funding is obviously a crunch. So for the time being, this will likely be the last big international trip for me a bit. I'm kind of kicking around the idea, mulling over the idea of maybe doing a trip to Quebec before the end of the year. I got to take a look at what my time off is going to look like. I'd really like to get a big muskie, but I've got my eyes set on something big, something very, very difficult for 2025. Something that, to my knowledge, no American angler has seemingly done, at least none that I've seen. A massive risk of failure, a considerable financial undertaking, but I need to be chasing the hardest targets while I have all my liberties, my physical capability, my wits, my youth. I'd rather tackle the most difficult things early. I have no idea whether this will be easier or harder for me down the road. All I know is that now my headspace is so clear with my pursuit. I'm so focused and determined on doing the things that I have wanted to do and not worry about all that extra stuff that seems to have gotten everyone else so tangled up. Social media status, the newest and nicest gear, some sort of recognition from brands or whatever. To be truly focused on the fishing and the experience, man, it's something that I think a lot of people think that they know. And even I thought I knew until recently. Anyway, though, to avoid a tangent, just thank you for listening and for following along. I just want to remind everyone, just remember that I chronicle all of the same trips in written form on boundlesspursuit.com. That's boundless-pursuit.com. The podcast thing is fun. It's pretty easy at this point, but the blog posts are generally more detailed, probably more structured, and I load them all down with cool photos and everything. So check that out as well. And I've got my contact information on there. I'd love to hear from you. Questions, feedback, anything. I'm always happy to interact and answer. These trips have really spawned a lot of feedback. They spawned a lot of questions. I've had so many people from the United States, from other countries, sending me questions about some of these trips, you know, who my contacts are, who I'm arranging these trips through. Unless it's some sort of secret or the person doesn't want anyone to know, I am generally an open book. I love helping people. I encourage more people, and I want to see more anglers doing these kinds of things. But anyway, yeah, for sure, check that out. I look forward to hearing from anybody. And if you've listened all the way up until this point that I'm talking right now, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Boundless Pursuit. Tune in each week as we bring stories and insight from uniquely talented anglers and outdoorsmen. And if you enjoyed this show, I want to hear from you. Be sure to leave a 5-star review, as this is going to drive the growth and exposure of this show. And if you have feedback or guest suggestions, I would love to hear from you. And you can reach me at boundlesspursuitfishing@gmail.com. For all other collections of media and contact information, please visit www.boundless-pursuit.com.